My friends, it's both a sad day but not an unexpected day that we now have the death of Pope Francis. I've been absolutely blown away in the last 12 hours at the deep grief and affection for Pope Francis, because I think he has shown us the contemporary face of Christ for the world. Like Jesus, I think Pope Francis has called all of us in the church, outside the church, to be more compassionate, welcoming to the stranger, and to be more hospitable. He certainly called all of us in the church to live more simply and more ecologically, to make sure our world is in a better place to hand on to the next generation. He strongly has spoken truth to power, but he's done it with charity, and often he's paid a price for that as well, as Jesus did. And indeed, he has inspired all of us to be more faithful, more hopeful, and more loving. Is there any way we couldn't imagine that the world now feels we have lost someone very special? But if we're going to look more in detail at what his life might be, I think that one of the great things, I think there are a number of things that the Pope has really given the Church. The first is that extraordinary emphasis on mercy, compassion and joy. He gave us a whole year of a year of mercy, where we're called to be the most compassionate people we could be, because God's been compassionate to us. God's merciful to us. And he told us to be joyful. He said, put a smile on your face. If you've got the good news, then radiate the good news. And I think that was incredibly important in the life of the church. He advocated for the poor and the marginalised, and particularly for refugees, for asylum seekers, for people who had to flee dictatorship and war. And by taking the name Francis of Assisi, of course, he was already indicating to the church that he wanted us to be the church of the poor for the poor. He's been very critical of unbridled capitalism, the Western world just getting richer and richer, and the gap between rich and poor getting greater and greater. He also, in 2015, published his very famous letter, Laudato Si, picking up the great hymn that St. Francis of Assisi gave us in the church, and the song of creation, Laudato Si, and really telling us it's a common home that we've got. And he wasn't trendy. Some people said, oh, this is all trendy environmentalism. It's as old as Genesis. So those who think Pope Francis was trendy on this question must think Genesis is a very trendy document, because we're given creation into our hands, not to wreck it, but to care for it. And that's the very big thing that Pope Francis picked up. A more technical one, which some people may not be as aware of, he's reformed the Vatican bureaucracy and its finances, made it more transparent, more accountable, and appointed women in charge of Vatican departments. No pope's ever done this before. Now, some women in the church, some men in the church have been frustrated about his issues, about what he's done for women. They want so much more. But he made a distinction between leadership and ordination, that women can be outstanding, magnificent leaders, like Mary MacKillop was for the Australian Church, and she wasn't ordained. But nonetheless, he has invited them into the very top echelons of leadership and told all the bishops, and indeed priests like me in parishes, to do exactly the same. He had a more pastoral approach. To my knowledge, he never changed any doctrine or dogma. He emphasised things within our doctrine, like our doctrine about care of creation, but he didn't change anything. But he was less dogmatic and more pastoral. So when he came to our LGBTQI plus brothers and sisters, when it came to women who've had an abortion, when it came to anybody who was a sinner, he said our first response should always be compassion and mercy. That's our first response, not to hit them over the head with their sinfulness and to talk about what they've done wrong. Welcome them with open arms to the love and mercy of God. He wanted a more listening church, and he challenged the whole church to keep listening. And he talked about being a synodal church, which is where we all take responsibility for who we are, and how we're governed. And so he invited lay people to have a voice and a vote at the international meetings there at the Vatican called synods. And he encouraged every bishop in every diocese to do exactly the same. And they're doing it, which is marvellous, where we're consulted, where we're taken seriously, and where the needs and the concerns and the anxieties of people's real lives have an impact now, and have a way of affecting the church's teaching. His outreach, especially to those who lived on the margins of the church, not just LGBTQI+, and not just women, but all of those who had walked away, especially those who had walked away over the sexual abuse crisis, over the despicable crimes that have been committed against some by church personnel, and the devastating impact that had on their families. He was slow to take that issue up because he didn't know much about it from Argentina. They do now, but of course it was already a massive issue throughout the Western world and the Western church in the Northern Hemisphere and in Australia. So that one he came to a bit slowly, but he got there in the end. And the way he always walked, spoke with and communicated and loved victims of abuse. And then what he did internally to say we have to be accountable to civil authorities and we had to be always working with those who need to find any criminals in our midst. He was a peacemaker. He worked very hard behind the scenes to do what he could with Israel and Gaza, with Russia and Ukraine, with many of the conflicts in Africa, with the crisis in Myanmar. He was there often not big public and profile in his profile, but he was there offering what he could to try and broker peace and that people be treated with dignity and respect. The last two is that he had extraordinary interfaith dialogue and ecumenical relations, particularly with our Orthodox brothers and sisters. He was a very close personal friend of the leader of the Orthodox Church, called the Ecumenical Patriarch. From his Buenos Aires days, his rabbis were very good friends of his, and of course he had wonderful relationships with our Islamic brothers and sisters. And he often spoke movingly about us being people of the one God who are trying to find the way together. So he worked for interreligious dialogue and our faith community. And finally, most movingly and probably most challengingly, he was a humble man who lived simply, and he thought if you're going to be like Jesus, you have to do the same. The word humble comes from the word humus, which means grounded. It's of the earth. And he was a man who was grounded. And following Jesus' own example, Francis was able to live very simply in all the ostentation of the Vatican. He wanted to live as simply as he could and encourage priests and bishops and all of the followers of Jesus to live as simply as we could so that all people might enjoy the great things God's given everyone in the earth.